Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast about neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of people who study computational neuroscience. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
I'm Connor.
And the topic for this episode is computational psychiatry. I think we should maybe start by explaining why this is kind of a topic to be discussed as something separate from computational neuroscience, because someone sitting next to you on a plane and asking you what you do, a lot of times if you say you're a neuroscientist, people will start asking you about like Alzheimer's or autism or diseases of the mind like that. And so it might not be clear to everyone that psychiatry is, the field that studies those kinds of things, whereas neuroscience frequently studies kind of the functioning brain and how things are processed normally. And so we're going to be talking about psychiatry, which is something separate from neuroscience for most people who study neuroscience. And so there is kind of this field of computational psychiatry that is a bit separate from computational neuroscience, and in that it's explicitly dealing with diseases and how to treat patients and how to diagnose patients.
But specifically for psychiatric illness, right? So, the distinctions are even maybe finer than you're suggesting, because within medical schools, there's neurology departments and psychiatry departments, and so I don't know, probably I don't know exactly where. I mean, none of us are doctors, right? But I don't know, and so I don't know exactly where the distinctions would be. But Alzheimer's maybe is accepted to be more of a brain-based disease, and while all psychiatric illnesses in some sort of philosophical sense stem from the brain, most of the way these things are treated is kind of divorced from a mechanistic understanding of what's going on in the brain when these things fail. So depression or schizophrenia or other such diseases, they're clearly grounded in the brain, and some of the treatments, if you're using psychopharmaceuticals, you're taking drugs that are supposed to be treating these diseases or illnesses, but the sort of basis of that mechanistically in terms of how it interacts with the brain is not, or arises from activity of the brain or misactivity of the brain, is not really well understood.
Yeah, so, neurology and psychiatry would be the two fields of medical science that deal with the nervous system in some way. And neurology, is, I think, associated with things that we have a more physical understanding of, like the peripheral nervous system or something like that. But I don't think that people would actually say that, psychiatry is the study of nervous system diseases that we don't understand yet.
Oh, no, I don't think anyone would word it that way, right?
That's just you being an arrogant fucker.
Yeah, and so it's obviously psychiatry's been around for a long time, and computational neuroscience has been around, I don't know, for a few decades at least. But the field of computational psychiatry is actually quite recent, as being kind of labeled as its own field and having any official designations or anything like that. And I think that also speaks to the fact that neuroscience and psychiatry are pretty different. The idea that we could have computational neuroscience for a while, but computational psychiatry never really came up.
It might even seem kind of like a almost controversial idea for neuroscientists, or a novel idea for neuroscientists, that you would attempt to study psychiatric illness from sort of a computational modeling perspective. I don't think that that doesn't strike everyone as so natural, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that there are good reasons why it's somewhat recent, and you could argue that maybe it's even still premature, at least for some of the goals that they have in the field, and we'll get into what falls under the umbrella of computational psychiatry. But yeah, so kind of to demonstrate how new it is, there was a somewhat recent center devoted to it that's kind of joint between University College London and Max Planck Center in Berlin, and that opened in 2014. And that's the Center for Computational Psychiatry and Aging. They kind of focus on dementia and developmental aspects of psychiatric illness. There is a recent journal that hasn't even published anything yet, but it opened for submissions for articles in June of 2016. That is the MIT Press's Journal of Computational Psychiatry. And then also, so we read a paper that was in Trends in Cognitive Science, and that paper was published in 2012, and it's just called computational psychiatry, and it refers to it as a new field. So that's kind of the timeline that we're dealing with. So it seems quite new.
I guess we could try to define what we understand as computational psychiatry. There are at least two, I think, definitions that came up in the two review articles that we read.
So Connor, what do you think the definition of computational psychiatry is?
Well, the two definitions I think that I kind of gleaned from these two reviews, one is the one that Grace mentioned called Computational Psychiatry, where Peter Diane is the last author, and the other is this one in Nature, Neuroscience. And I think the two definitions kind of mirror these two uses of the word computational in computational neuroscience. So one is just kind of a definition where you're studying psychiatry using quote-unquote computational tools, which can be a kind of broad blanket-ish term for the use of like simulation and mathematics and statistics and machine learning to study the problem. And then the other definition might be something along the lines of trying to understand psychiatric illnesses as pathologies of the actual computations that the brain itself is attempting to perform. So Peter Diane made that. Peter Diane referred kind of explicitly to computational psychiatry, I think, as mainly this kind of second approach, trying to study the computations the brain is performing and how they kind of might be pathological in psychiatric disease. So like understanding, for example, anxiety as arising from malfunctioning learning, where like learning is a type of computation, say. And in the Nature Neuroscience review, they were kind of also talking about just, using modern sort of data analytic techniques to classify and define symptoms in psychiatric diseases in like new ways. They also refer to that as kind of computational, whereas you're not necessarily trying to understand the disease as a malfunctioning of a computation.
I guess I would say that both of the reviews also allowed for the type of work that tries to build a mechanistic model of like what's happening with different neural populations. I don't know if that would fall cleanly into either of the ones that you mentioned.
Right, yeah, I guess that's true.
So it actually, I feel like it lines up with different categories of computational neuroscience. We can kind of analyze data or model the computations we think the brain is doing or model what we think neurons are doing to implement computations. I actually kind of enjoyed that these articles laid out these distinctions and the different realms of computational work, because you don't actually see that explicitly acknowledged in computational neuroscience, I feel like. And I guess it makes sense that like if you're writing an article that's introducing a field to computational work, you need to kind of explicitly say what computational work is.
Yeah, so for psychiatrists or whatever, when they're first hearing about this, the natural question would be like, well, why is something computational going to help me? Like, what does that even mean? What are you claiming you're going to be able to do with computational tools, or what's the benefit of bringing them to this field? And so spelling out that like one way of thinking about the disorders is that they are sort of issues concerning appropriate or healthy computations in a brain, or you can characterize the variability of ways in which people's behavior corresponds to different kinds of computations in certain settings, and then characterize the sort of distribution of those sets of traits, sort of using machine learning tools, and that this might be more maybe objective than other forms of diagnosis. These are the kinds of things that start making it concrete. So maybe we should just spell that out a bit more, right? So
yeah.
I guess there's sort of I mean, I've sort of extracted maybe like two motifs in this kind of work, and we can talk about how these are concretely done. But so the first kind of thing is right now, and this is sort of in the context of this work so far, it's admittedly kind of simple tasks, but you take some task that you can subject a person to, and it's like a super simple task, like learn how to solve this very simple game, or like, you know, you do something where there's like, you have two choices, and then each of those two choices gives you one of two outcomes probabilistically, and you just have to learn what choices to make to maximize reward, or for some other kind of setting in that space. But some very simple task like this, where you're making a small number of choices and there are a small number of outcomes, and then it's just the rate at which you learn that thing is measured, and a few other properties of your behavior are measured. And basically, you can fit a decision-making model, like a super simple decision-making model, to people's choices in this setting. And you can look at the parameters of that model, and you can see that sort of different clusters of parameters in that model correspond to sort of different cognitive, behavioral, decision-making phenotypes, or groups of behavior. And then you can sort of view those as either like diagnosis clusters or like symptom clusters. And this provides like another diagnostic tool instead of like surveys or patient interviews to diagnose people.
Rather than having someone come in and say like, I've been having trouble with like being really impulsive and I can't, focus or something like that. You can have someone come in and they say that, but in order to kind of really probe what the problem is, rather than just taking, their self-description, you can have them to play these types of games and actually see if, when they're playing these games, does the way that they play them actually fit impulsivity, or, how do they compare to other types of people who have played them? And so you can extract models that describe their behavior in the game and compare what their behavior looks like to people who show certain other clusters of symptoms that may be all the same disease or something like that.
So that's like the first motif, is like fitting people's behavior when you put them in some simple setting. And that's kind of like another diagnostic tool in addition to these surveys. And like the other motif is actually then like doing kind of large scale data mining, let's say, on a whole bunch of people's parameters that are extracted from these tasks. So if you have, because it's now like a task, I mean, you could do this with survey data in the past, but this is like a different way of doing it. Instead of getting 1,000 or 2,000 people to take a survey and then looking at patterns in the data, here you can have 1,000 or 2,000 or more people on the internet play basically a little game, and depending on how they play that game, you can sort of cluster the people into different groups, or look for trends or patterns in description, mathematical or sort of quantitative descriptions you extract from their behavior.
I mean, and you can do this, I think, importantly, because this comes up a lot in these articles about the field, is the benefit of combining different, what would be called phenotyping, like figuring out the way people behave or what traits they have. You can have people play these games and get mathematical descriptions of their behavior, but you can also combine that with survey data, and then you just kind of have more inroads to ways to describe people and to cluster people. And then if you want to go even further, they talk about combining it with fMRI data on patients or EEG data, so you're actually using neural markers combined with survey data and behavioral data.
Maybe we could talk about this eLife paper just as like a specific example, just to make it concrete.
Sure, sounds good. So you want to summarize that for
Sure.
us?
So this is a paper where the senior author is Nathaniel Daw from NYU. It's called Characterizing a Psychiatric Symptom Dimension Related to Deficits in Goal-Directed Control. So the way they kind of describe their paper in the abstract is basically they identify something called goal-directed control, which is supposed to be a kind of, I guess goal-directed control would be a type of behavior, say. And the idea is that people vary in terms of how much, goal-directed control they exhibit in a variety of situations, say. And that you can measure this by having people perform certain kinds of tasks, and then there's some kind of computational theory, learning theory sort of behind this, where you can kind of think of people as using different learning strategies, and then somehow the amount of one learning strategy versus the other that people use is kind of what you're calling or goal-directed control, or what you think can be a measure of how much goal-directed control they exhibit, say. So that's just roughly it kind of is something related to how habitual are they versus how much can they kind of use complex models of the world to exert sort of top-down control over their decisions, maybe counter their habits sometimes. So this notion of goal-directed control, and the idea, I guess, is that people have kind of thought that variability in terms of goal-directed control is related to a variety of psychiatric disorders. But the problem that they point to is that, right, so people kind of have thought that this, deficits in goal-directed control can be associated with disorders like OCD and addiction. But a problem, yeah.
So that was that was kind of not immediately intuitive to me when they described that relationship. But I guess they're saying that if you don't have this goal-directed behavior, which I think can kind of be called, something similar to long-term planning, or the ability to kind of think of several steps to get to a goal, based on some knowledge you have about the world. In the absence of the ability to do that, then people fall into repetitive behaviors, which I guess I never considered something like OCD as due to the absence of goal-directed behavior, but more kind of like the presence of a strong urge or something like that. So it wasn't immediately obvious to me that these things were even related. But
that itself is kind of a finding that is supposed to be based on previous literature. So I think in previous work from this group and others, they're kind of, this is based on a sort of previous claim that they have made, which is that measuring this goal-directed control thing in certain tasks kind of is a useful phenotype to look at, and kind of is correlated with having things like OCD and addiction. But it's not clear that it should be like strongly related, say, to OCD. It seems like OCD has other characteristics, like you mentioned. And so that's kind of sort of part of what they then talk about, which is that deficits in goal-directed control actually are seen in lots of other psychiatric conditions apart from addiction and OCD. So in some way, it's not very specific. So what they do essentially is use this kind of online thing we've been talking about. They use Amazon's Mechanical Turk actually to have many people both play this game that is used to assess how much goal-directed control they have, and then also to fill out lots of surveys and self-report, right? Symptoms, like kind of answer questions related that are supposed to be a measure of how compulsive they are, and various other kind of things like this. And then then what they do is they actually kind of use some data analysis techniques to find which combinations of different behavioral patterns as assessed from the questionnaire are most strongly correlated with or predicted by variability in a person's goal-directed control, essentially. Do you want to elaborate?
Well, yeah, so people take these surveys and they self-report, and then again they're throwing in an actual measure of behavior to be able to assess. I mean, I feel like the combination of behavior and self-assessment is meant to provide an objective fact check against people's self-report in a way. I mean, that's not what they focus on in this article. But then, the idea is that they then want to look at what the self-reported patterns of traits, how those relate to the actual behavior on the task. And I guess the idea is that the kind of part that lines up most with what these other reviews talk about as being a benefit of advanced computational approach is that they have this survey which has, hundreds of questions, and they're kind of able to do some kind of dimensionality reduction on it to kind of get at the main components, kind of patterns across all of these questions that capture something relevant for the prediction of goal-directed behavior.
Right, and so it seems useful, right? I mean, so in the end, then the point is like if you have certain kind of deficit in this goal-directed control thing, it increases the likelihood that a person will have like a variety of different disorders. And so in a way you can think of them as just kind of doing like a change of variables in sort of disorder space, and they're trying to find whichever a kind of a new mixture of symptoms as like
so this gets to something that's like almost a philosophical point, which is that it's not clear that diseases are like caused by the same thing. Like what people sort of in the taxonomy of disorders, what people will label a certain disorder may or may not actually arise from the same sort of genetic or environmental abnormality. And depending on what people can measure, people tend to recategorize things. So like back in the day when, you would see an older person and they would sort of have gradual age-related cognitive decline, you might label all of those things dementia. I mean, I'm being a little haphazard here. Mm-hmm. But, as we kind of get a better sense of why some of these different disorders arise, we maybe have greater resolution to like the kinds of age-related cognitive decline we label. And so there's like subcategories, or we label Alzheimer's a certain category because it arises from a certain cluster of causes that we maybe know a little bit more about, or something like this. And in this case, maybe OCD was called one thing, but because to a certain observer or a certain set of observers historically, they viewed it as one thing. And there's probably other good reasons why it is called one thing, and I'm not trying to rewrite the whole literature there. But now with this sort of new measurement technique, a task that has like some computational motivation, where there's like a theory associated with it, where you can measure a certain sort of type in that task, maybe it's natural to think of that type as somehow relevant or fundamental, and re-taxonomize certain disorders around these new measurable things.
Yeah, I feel like this paper kind of is trying to claim that they're kind of cleaning things up a bit in this direction. Like, it is the case that psychiatry seems to suffer from the fact that a lot of disorders have the same symptoms. I mean, not exactly the same, but there's a lot of overlapping symptoms in a lot of different disorders. And they're saying that, getting this big data set of having a bunch of people online take surveys and do this behavior, they were able to tease things apart, because their findings are that, despite the fact that there were reports that anxiety and depression are also related to deficits in goal-directed behavior, they actually see that the impulsivity is like the major trait that relates to changes in this goal-directed behavior on their task. And so I think they're trying to say that if you have enough data, you can kind of clean things up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it still requires that you believe that their task, their behavioral task, is an accurate window into what we like. If you have some colloquial notion, or if you have some semi-formal but non-quantitative notion of goal-directed control or goal-directed behavior as like a clinical psychiatrist, if you believe that their task is measuring the same kind of thing that you're thinking of when you think of goal-directed behavior, then how this task correlates with other things, like maybe this big online data set serves as somehow maybe more of a bit more objective of a way of capturing that pattern of that behavior relative to sort of a person's impression, like a psychiatrist or a set of psychiatrists' impressions when they talk to lots of patients.
Right.
Yeah.
A thing I liked about this paper on a very sort of loose level is the idea that they're using healthy patients, like the normal population, kind of the general population, and they're measuring variability along various dimensions that are self-reported, and looking for structure in that space, and sort of, I mean, like, you know, as opposed to just kind of taking people who are kind of like aberrant in some way, quote unquote, and talking about them as somehow like totally distinct from the rest of the population. So like you can imagine, like if you had infinite data, you could just kind of sort of just measure and kind of quantify human behavior in general across the whole population, and then you would just be able to extract the structure of it, and maybe a lot of diseases can be seen as just kind of outlierish in that space, or potentially there are some that are like separate clusters totally by themselves and so forth. And I don't know, it's just kind of I like the idea of a more, right, the history of how we study mental illness is kind of weird and associated with lots of things like taboos and like people being scary and spooky. I like this kind of clinical, cold, data analytic approach in general to like defining mental illness. I just enjoy that. Maybe I'm creepy for enjoying it.
Well, I like the idea that your complaint was that psychiatry wasn't clinical and cold enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that they look at you with a medical gaze or, you know, sort of dehumanize you. It's that it's that they were stigmatizing you too much through
with their passions.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, another thing though that this, I don't know, kind of. The interesting thing about doing this in a very behavioral way is it feels like it mirrors very closely the way people already think about what you can glean from behavior, like what you click on or what you like on the internet or whatever, right, is giving people information about you. And, you know, like you can guess if someone's a man or a woman based on like what kind of stuff they've liked on Facebook, right? I mean, It's sort of... you know, obviously not perfectly, but like statistically speaking.
Yeah, well,
this kind of feels like
in the Nature Neuroscience review, and I don't know if we said the authors of that. It's Hughes, Maya, and Frank, but they were talking about how like, okay, so why is computational psychiatry becoming a thing now? And the reasons that they gave were like, well, there's a lot more data available now, and like the computational models and computing power is better, and that's like the same reasons that were given for why machine learning and deep learning are taking off, and that's what's powering like the, you know, advertisers' ability to know things about you based on your online behavior.
Right. I mean, it obviously brings up all sorts of creepy possibilities, you know, when internet giants have all the information, and you know, Google has some project where they're like are collecting genetic as part of one of their things, where they're collecting like like genomes of lots of the normal population, which is cool and could obviously be used for all kinds of like interesting things. But yeah, maybe they'll be able to tell if you're like whatever, if you have some mental illness, and then do terrible things to you based on that or something. Not that Google seems to want to do terrible things to people.
They're just going to show you specific advertisements for it.
Yeah, or I don't know, whatever.
So yeah, this side of things seems more related to the idea that computational psychiatry can use a lot of data to help with kind of just the actual definition of diseases,
yes,
to actually cluster things in a more formal way, rather than having people say like, well, I see some people who are like, you know, they have hallucinations and they're anxious, so I'm going to say that they're schizophrenic, and there's other people who are depressed and anxious, so that's a different thing. So it's meant to kind of formalize the definitions of these different disorders. There was also the review was talking about kind of removing the concept of a disorder at all, at least like a labeled disorder. So they were just going, or people have modeled symptoms as a network. So there's just like nodes in the network that represent different symptoms like anxiety or problem sleeping or something like that. And just kind of defining, people as being in a kind of symptom state and doing network analysis on this to see how you could, transfer between states. And so because this makes sense to me because not only are there overlaps between the symptoms that show up in different diseases, but these symptoms clearly have kind of causal relationships. So, if you're sleep deprived, you will probably be fatigued and maybe you won't go out and then you'll feel socially isolated or something. You can imagine how these things relate to each other and how they can interact with each other even without the need to kind of label a cluster of them as a certain disease, especially when we don't have quite enough knowledge to say that we know where these symptoms stem from, and so we can call that a disease that has a certain source. So this idea of modeling things as just a network of symptoms seems kind of more honest for our current state of understanding of a lot of them.
Yeah.
So there is, though, a trade-off where I think it's kind of assumed in this work that you're not just getting another sort of description. It's not just another sort of,
right.
I put superficial in kind of quotes, kind of description, like a survey. If you ask people, are they impulsive, and they say they're impulsive, and then you label them as impulsive, that's kind of okay, but it's not I don't know, it's just you ask them something and there was a description involved. These behaviors could just get at that. It's you have a task that measures impulsivity, and then you call the people impulsive if they score high on that task.
Right.
And I think that's what psychiatry has been doing for a while.
Yeah, there's a grander aim here somehow.
Exactly. So psychiatry for a long time has had tasks to measure things in addition to surveys and stuff like this,
right.
Where if people score certain ways on tasks, like an IQ test, for example, which is not just a survey, you actually have to do something and you're assessed on it. The grander aim here is that these kinds of tasks, these kinds of games that are given to the people are especially informative about the sort of, let's say, cognitive mechanism.
Or so we hope, right?
Yeah, that's the hope, right? I mean, is that there's something about the computation performed by the person in order to solve the problem is informative, semi-mechanistically.
Yeah, so we have some sort of, that's the kind of Diane notion of computational. You have some notion of the actual, sort of computational level mechanisms that happen in the brain normally. And so, the kind of long-term aim would be that you would find ways of measuring behavior and kind of have these behavioral quote or sort of slash computational phenotypes that would really be separate diseases in the sense that there would be actually distinct computational mechanisms and kind of therefore physical neural mechanisms underlying the different diseases, which would allow you, if you really understood them, to design really targeted treatments, right?
And I think that's a cool prospect, but I think the risk, and especially with very simple tasks, is that this is a rebranding, in a sense, of more, old school psych tests or psych assessments.
Right.
With a new taxonomy, because the tasks are a bit different, and with more quantitative formalism or jargon behind it. And so that is the risk. And I think to demonstrate that these are superior to the older ones, you have to probably demonstrate sort of more clinical efficacy or utility of these new distinctions.
Right.
And they have to kind of on some longer timescale play nice with the sort of computational narratives that we develop about how the brain actually works. So whereas the sort of old psych assessments didn't maybe do that as much, but I mean, I don't know. On some level, it does feel like in the olden days, people thought that they were developing assessments which got at the meat of what was really going on in the brain as well.
Yeah.
So we always think that we're doing it right.
Or it goes in and out of fashion, maybe. But, So I don't know. That's I mean,
Yeah. I mean, an actually distinct thing, which is just separate from this whole computational phenotyping type of discussion, is just the use of new modern measurements, right? So you can just like do a bunch of EEG stuff for a bunch of MRI measurements on people and then use those things as like regressors or, variables in classifiers for, detecting whether or not someone, or classifying someone as having or not having, or the degree to which they have or do not have different kind of psychiatric disorders. So that's a different thing that's actually new and kind of, but it doesn't kind of really rely as much on any notions of computational theory, the theory of cognition or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think another important thing is so even very recently and currently, a lot of studies will say, okay, I'm going to study something about autism. I'm going to find people who are autistic, and I'm going to give them some tasks, and then I'm going to find a control group that isn't, and I'm going to give them some tasks. And so it's this study that's basically just there is this disease and there's not. And if you have data sets that are large enough and include enough variety, you can study all of the diseases at once, and I think that that's what can lead to better kind of a more informed way of carving them up. You have a fuller understanding of their interactions and what really looks like something separate.
Yeah, but going back to Connor's point, I think there's one view of disease that there's lots of variability in the healthy population, and some people are so extreme in certain axes or certain dimensions that they should be labeled as disease because they're outliers. So everyone's a little bit depressed, kind of on some level, but or to some or
you may have a biased sample,
or people are slightly depressed, or some people are not at all depressed. That variable ranges, and if you're very depressed, then it's a clinical issue. But another view, right, is that that some of the people are sort of particularly extreme, not because they're part of the natural variation that deviates too far by chance, or by random variation, but because there's some fundamental cause underlying why they're extreme.
But I think I when you say that, I understand what you mean, but then when I think about it, it's okay, fundamental cause. What does that mean?
Well, like a genetic mutation or something like that.
So because obviously we don't just mean that there's something different about their brains.
Incident.
Because everyone has different brains, and so it's not just their brain structure is different. It has to be something.
Let's say there's some genetic or set of genetic causes.
It's discontinuously. It's discontinuously different in some space, right? Or in some irreducibly kind of not connected in some appropriate space of brain structure or something.
But getting back to this point though, if you were to take a set of people, potentially even a large set of people, online kind of randomly, and give them tasks, you might not get at disease under that notion. This is not fundamental to computational psychiatry, but this is just sort of a side point.
Yeah.
If you want to characterize the space of sort of psychiatric health and disease, it might not be sufficient to take a random sample of even a rather large number of people, because if a certain disease is relatively rare, you might only get a handful of people with that disorder. And so the sort of standard style of assessing, of getting two groups equal sizes, one that's diseased and one that's not diseased with a certain disease, can be necessary if those people don't occur with much frequency in the natural population. Now, if you get kind of really massive online data sets, of course, you'll overcome this problem by swamping it with numbers as well. I
do wonder if it really is going to switch to a lot of these online data sets. People have talked about how it's the fact that most psychological studies are done on undergrads at elite Western universities creates kind of a weird sense of what is human. And it could be the same. People who are willing to sit on Mechanical Turk and do menial tasks for hours might be a very particular subset of the population.
They're all obsessive.
I just love clicking things.
Yeah. I think another thing, this is slightly switching, we can come back if you... that I liked, just a thought that occurred to me was, in the Nature Neuroscience review, and it was talked about in the Diane review also, was I mean, just this, theories like reinforcement learning or like sort of statistical learning theory, things about Bayesian type stuff where you should kind of keep track of priors over, aspects of the environment and these kinds of things, and how those different things should inform learning. Just kind of somewhat formal characterization of like what learning is and what sort of optimal things to do are in a variety of different situations are. It's useful to, as a thought I had was like, it's potentially useful to kind of try to understand, to have computational theories that describe how people actually learn and how those things are related, like why they do it that way, quote unquote, or by having some, say, normative explanation, like people do it this way because evolution has designed it to do it this way because that's the right way to do it or something. Because it seems like learning could potentially be very important, right? If you have if for example it turns out that a lot of cases of anxiety are caused by some imbalance, say in like serotonin or something, which means that, and serotonin is involved in some learning system, and then you have kind of mal-learning that causes anxiety. So like you've learned that the world, like, learned helplessness is an example, right? You've sort of learned that the world is in fact very unpredictable, and maybe the right, quote unquote, right thing to do is in fact, given that this is what you think is the case, is to kind of become helpless. If you really think that such kind of mal-learning is the cause of a disease, then it might be really important to actually give people a treatment, say, that corrects the serotonin imbalance, if that's really the thing that's wrong in the brain, but not just do that, but combine that with the appropriate relearning. And the relearning might be like really the kind of the most important thing. And if you just gave them if you just corrected the serotonin imbalance or something and didn't have this relearning procedure, it would be kind of nowhere near as effective. I don't know. I hadn't quite thought about that before. I'm sure psychiatrists and stuff think about this all the time. But
I think that like people talk about cognitive behavioral therapy being something that's very effective, and usually it's or at least many times it's combined with like people taking antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication while going through like a very particular type of behavioral therapy.
I see.
So I don't think that came from a computational model of learning. I think that was kind of trial and error.
But you can imagine, right, trial and error. But you can imagine then if you had some like really thorough kind of theory of all the different kinds of learning that people can do, you'd be able to like better design.
You give them the right cocktail of drugs to prime them for like new learning in a controlled situation.
Plus the right cocktail of like learning, say, tasks or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that comes up in talking about this, especially the idea that like, there's some medications that can be given to put them into a better learning state. This is a problem that obviously comes up in psychiatry and any kind of translational science. Like, we need to know how learning works normally. And in the case of kind of playing with neurotransmitter levels, we would need to know on like a fairly detailed level, because those things have hugely complicated interactions with each other and with different cell types and all kinds of things. So it always seems like, the idea that in psychiatry, like neuroscience is just a sub-problem. It's like, well, we want to create treatments that will help people. We'll create treatments that are based on some understanding of the brain. Oh, I guess we have to understand the brain. It puts it in a very weird place, because there is this pressure to kind of just try to make things that work even without understanding. But obviously it seems like it would be better if there was understanding.
At the same time, a lot of the neuropsychiatric pharmaceuticals are, they're so crude in terms of what they do. Like SSRIs being this classic example, they just, inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, and serotonin is like all over the brain. From loads of animal studies, we know that it's involved in all kinds of different behaviors, does things like has loads of different effects in all sorts of parts of the brain and so on. And yet, like, it's used like for lots of different diseases in a way that's like kind of puzzling. So like it seems like there's so much room for, I mean, again, it's also kind of amazing that these things, even though they seem so crude, do actually help a lot of people. So that's also kind of interesting. But there just seems that there's so much room for improvement. I don't know. This reading these made me kind of vaguely optimistic that, you know, including any of this stuff kind of has to help, I guess. And there were some examples where they showed better results.
Yeah, there's this, I mean, so kind of divorced from a mechanistic understanding of how things work, they actually talk about using, you know, kind of machine learning style approaches just to be able to predict who will respond to certain treatments. So if you, so it's like known that people, usually there will be some antidepressant that people respond to well, but it's not the same for everyone. And so they have to cycle through different drugs to find the one that works for an individual person. But if you could feed into a model, maybe, I don't know, maybe fMRI data, maybe behavioral data, something like that, then you could predict what type of antidepressant a person will respond to best. And there's been successes in that, but that's, you know, there's no even attempt to understand why certain people respond better. It's just to figure out the mapping, and if you have enough data, you can do that. I mean, that seems like a great use of these kinds of tools, but it's
not
divorced from understanding.
Right, yeah, that's like there's no computational understanding, and there's definitely no neural understanding. It's just purely like, let's analyze the data as best we can to figure out which features are going to predict outcome.
I do sometimes feel like this is the sort of, I don't know if it's the dirty secret or it's just like a reality of a lot of scientific subfields, is that, right, these kinds of more opaque methods tend to be where a lot of the practical gains come from.
Yeah.
And then, you know, scientists do what they do because they're interested in getting understanding of the systems. But in order to sort of leverage what's going on for any kind of applications, it's often the case that these kinds of opaque methods really do the work, sometimes even better than the sort of scientifically transparent approaches.
This really reminded me, actually, on that note, of for example, like economics, and I think it's a good example to keep in mind, to kind of inhibit oneself from sort of fetishizing quote unquote mechanistic theories if they're not actually useful, except for just kind of being intellectually pleasing and, of course, paving the way for future understanding. But like in economics, for example, I mean, you know, as far as I understand, if you want to like open a quantitative hedge fund and make a whole lot of money, you're going to be using models, right? Which
is like applied economics.
Applied economics, quote unquote, right? So, you know, you're trying to understand a piece of the economy, like a market, and what those people use, they definitely do not use the models that academic economists study. They use like machine learning techniques that just throw in features of the data and try to predict prices. Of course, and so on the other hand, right, the academy in economics is kind of famously, although I'm a little ignorant here, so maybe I'm saying something totally wrong, sort of obsessed with mathematical beauty and like elegant theoretical explanations that build up from assumptions about the behavior of individuals to properties of whole economies and so forth. That being said, it is the case that like central banks and so on do actually use such models, big computational versions of those models, like huge ones with lots of parameters that they fit and so on. So that's goes into the kind of domain of the more machine learning type thing, but it's some kind of in between. But yeah, it's just another example. And like that, you know, it's a good example to bear in mind because like everybody complains all the time about bloody economists being away with the fucking fairies and being obsessed with things that nobody cares about when we just want to like make the thing work properly, you know. And the hedge funds, the people who are making lots of money, are using precisely these opaque methods to like make lots of money because they work.
So you're siding with the hedge fund people?
Well, I think they're smarter, but you know, that's why they're winning.
Yeah, I guess that is it's a very explicit example of something that plays out on a much more subtle scale in neuroscience versus psychiatry. Yeah. Although I guess, no, I mean, there is a pretty direct comparison because pharmaceutical companies are interested in whatever works and not necessarily why.
Yeah.
And I think from the perspective of people inside academia, it isn't really perceived that pharmaceutical companies are doing sort of fundamental science, really, so much as they're doing empirical assessment of different approaches.
Yeah.
Which I imagine is somewhat similar to the kind of machine learning engineering that gets done when people are trying to figure out how markets work and stuff for the purposes of finance.
I mean, it reminds me, I heard of some guy who works for a pharmaceutical company once just say like that the propositions that come out of translational neuroscience, like people who are using, animal models to propose targets for drugs, are usually just disastrously bad. So there's like this attitude where they kind of are annoyed by the scientists, and then like the scientists are smug and they're like, oh, those people are not real scientists. It's funny as well because it reminds me of there's actually this thing I just mentioned. There's actually a term for that in economics. Like, I mean, I think they just call it like the market test. It's like your theory's no good if nobody's using it to make money, basically, which I think is hilarious.
So in this context, your sort of neuroscience or psychiatric theory is not useful if it's not curing patients or something like that.
Well, I think you could also use making money.
Yeah, if a pharmaceutical company is not making a lot of money using it, then which is sort of a sad state of affairs, right? It's not like, because it's not, but I think it's actually, this is an interesting political point, right? Because it's a terrible measure, I think, because pharmaceutical companies don't make money by curing the greatest number of diseases possible. They cure the diseases that rich people have, or that people who can pay to have their diseases cured have. So there's like a bias.
Yeah, and a lot of times they they kind of turn a side effect of a drug into the main effect by rebranding it.
Yeah.
Like there's all these commercials lately about if you have like kind of what would seem like fatal dry eye based on how dramatic these commercials are. But I have to imagine it was just like they were trying to make a drug for something else. People said, like, this makes my eyes really watery. And they're like, well, let's sell it to people who have dry eye.
Oh, that's brilliant.
First, let's tell people that dry eye is like an actual condition that requires a prescription.
Yeah.
And then,
yeah, exactly. People.
But so to transfer from talking about how there's no mechanistic understanding to the modeling of mechanisms, because this is actually something that is considered part of the computational psychiatry effort, is the idea that you can build, neural circuit models that are meant to actually be describing something that's happening in the brain of someone with some psychiatric disorder. So some of the examples that they give are, in computational neuroscience, widely, there's the use of these things called attractor models. They're used to model working memory a lot, and so the idea is that if you have this model network of neurons and they're all connected to each other, and you give an input to this network, so it's kind of just activating some subset of these neurons, you can then remove the input and those neurons will remain active. And so this is kind of supposed to be like memory, because you can kind of show someone something, take it away, and they can still remember what they were just shown because you have the same pattern of neural activity. And so this is used to model a lot of different things, apparently, related to psychiatry, because you can kind of change parameters in the model that could represent certain types of neurotransmitter receptors, and you can make people less able, or make the model, less good at remembering. And so, for example, I think in schizophrenia, there's been documented evidence of a decrease in NMDA receptors on inhibitory cells, and if you perturb the model in a way that is meant to be analogous to that kind of thing, you can get worse working memory in these models. So this would be an example of trying to explain neurally, mechanistically, a symptom of a disease using something that is correlated with incidence of that disease. I think this is the part of computational psychiatry that probably feels most premature.
Yeah, definitely.
Because people do use these models for working memory in computational neuroscience, but I don't think that people really feel like their connection to behavior is so direct. Because usually when you're using these models to study something that was found in animals, you're not trying to necessarily match a lot of the animal's behavior. You have actual recordings from the neurons, and you're just trying to match the neurons in your model to the neurons in the animal's brain. And that's a very, that's a clearer, cleaner connection than behavior to neural activity in your model.
Yeah. It's also, I don't know, it's just, I feel like maybe I'm just biased, but when I read a statement about like NMDA receptors or something, well, no, I guess because that's just about slowness, isn't it? Yeah. When you read,
this is the issue though. There's a lot of different ways to model, the effects of changing NMDA receptor numbers.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of the correspondence between what's found in the data and how you manipulate the model is obviously a little messy.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a really
I wouldn't be so harsh. I would just maybe say that the gap, sort of, in terms of current science, the explanatory gap between individual neurons and populations of neural activity is still not well bridged. Populations of neural activity to simple behaviors is not well bridged. Simple behaviors to cognitive disorders is not well bridged. And so to hope that with the current levels of knowledge, you can go all the way from receptors to disorder seems like there's a compounding errors problem to me.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I feel okay with the, model neuron to data neuron equivalence. And that's the research that I do. I build these kinds of models and try to fit them to actual neural data. So I hope that I'm okay with that. But yeah, to go all the way to like the complex set of behaviors that is schizophrenia. I mean, technically they're trying to understand one symptom of it, but they're making this, they're motivated by the fact that schizophrenic patients have this NMDA receptor change. I think it certainly seems like psychiatry is, in an interesting way, kind of, they're most focused, or historically have been most focused on some of the like smallest scale mechanisms, things like receptors on neurons or neurotransmitters, specific neurotransmitter levels, or genes. And I feel like that feels strange when, you're in neuroscience and you see the full range of the field, because most of computational neuroscience, or at least a lot of the mainstream computational neuroscience, would be more comparable to what's called systems neuroscience, where you're looking at large populations of neurons in certain brain areas as an animal performs a very simple task. And that seems more related to behavior that would be of interest to psychiatrists. But that level of modeling rarely cares about genes or receptor types. And so it seems like the history of psychiatry, the historical approach, makes this huge leap from like really small scale all the way up to really complicated behavior.
But I mean, so I think a lot of it is geared by an eye towards interventions. I mean, in the
Sure, yeah.
Like in the earlier days of psychiatry. I mean, if we talk like I guess like 100 years ago, or even a little less, using like electroconvulsive therapy or lobotomies or things like this to sort of attempt to cure psychiatric illness, right? I mean, those were both premature, but at the same time, like they thought they were being mechanistic at the time with those kinds of things. Like to say like, oh, there's a part of the brain in the front of the brain that if we get rid of, it'll make these people more docile. Mm-hmm. Like for the time, that was supposed.
Mechanism.
I mean, it was a crude mechanism. But
it was true as well, I guess.
Sure.
But,
yeah. But also, like, it didn't really do things for the right reasons. And so you saw a correlation between something mechanistic and the behavioral changes, and you can jump onto that. I mean...
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a lot of reasons why it is this way, both because of the interventions that were available. Obviously, it's easier to give someone a pill that's going to kind of affect some global state of the brain rather than targeting specific patterns of neurons. Also, it's kind of like, when you the idea that you look for your keys under a street light because that's where the light is, not because that's where you lost your keys.
Yeah.
But because, historically, what can you measure? I mean, we still can't measure patterns of neural activity on any detailed level in a human brain, while they're behaving, except for in some rare circumstances where we have to open up their skull for other reasons. So, yeah, obviously, we can measure levels, kind of gross levels of neurotransmitter more easily. We can measure genes more easily. So that's the only place you can kind of grasp onto.
Right. I mean, I'm sure we're obviously going to look back in, 50 or 100 years at the things we're doing now and think that they're very crude and funny, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to believe that we wouldn't look back at these tasks and view them as the next iteration of sort of behavioral assessments.
Yeah.
Right.
They're not discontinuous with that in any way, really.
Yeah, I don't feel like they're fundamentally new. They're an improvement in the sense that they're like, founded in more contemporary theories about how the brain works, but presumably as more understanding about how the brain works arrives, you'll iterate again.
Yeah. In some ways,
more a sort of process that way.
In some ways, the more I don't know. It's not. It's also not qualitatively new, but the more kind of actually modern thing, I think, is stuff related to like the internet. So just like the ability, and the fact that we have fast computers, just like the use and the kind of will to and the realization that it's important to gather like enormous data sets and the possibility of using like a lot of computational power and computational tools from machine learning to just study that data to better understand.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that this was also kind of a good summary point, and that to me it does seem like the sort of takeaway from this, the part that is like useful and kind of more fundamentally new, is this gathering a big data set, I guess mostly of healthy people, on these behavioral tasks and doing data mining on that to look for cognitive behavioral phenotypes that correlate well with our understanding of mental illness.
In a way that's, it feels a little bit like a paradigm shift, but technically it's obviously just a scaling up. So it feels a little revolutionary,
but
it's still
lets
in line.
lets you drive things with the data, right? That's what's always been the case in these kind of big scaling, like across fields. The scaling up lets you look at the data and see the patterns, and they just pop out more. With the right tools, like statistical tools, the patterns pop out a bit more than they do. Like if you talk to, as a doctor, you talk to tens of patients about something, and you kind of build your intuitions over years about, and then sort of qualitatively characterize these patterns.
Right.
So it feels like it's, to me, it does feel a bit more objective.
Yeah, it's this kind of discovery thing, right? The idea like you have some algorithm which is a bit like it's predefined. It's kind of, once it's been written into code, is kind of removed from the human beings using it, and you just kind of put data through it, and out pops like knowledge that you can use or something.
And of course, it's messier than that, and you change the parameters a bit. Yeah.
No,
yeah,
it's
but
just like that. Pops right out.
Yeah, it just pops right out. Yeah. Someday.
Okay, is that all?
I think so.
All right. Good job. See you next time.
Bye.
Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.